A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 19. My father was so absorbed in whatever reading he was doing that he barely said a word for the rest of the day. This was fine with me. I didn't want to talk, because I always felt like my parents were testing me, trying to decide if I'd finally crossed the line into insanity or if I was going to get back to normal. As far as I was concerned, normal didn't exist anymore. I lived in a world filled with killers and monsters. I didn't see a path back to childhood. Even as an adult, I don't think there was one. Some things can't be undone. Growing up is one of those things. One thing had changed for the better, though. I'd gotten word to my friends about what was happening. They would figure out a way to help me. I didn't know how they would do it, but at least they wouldn't be locked inside their homes with no access to the outside world. If there was a way to fight whatever the intruders were, my friends would scour the entire juvenile section of the library until they found it. I dreaded sundown that night, as I had ever since the intruders began tormenting me, but they didn't wait on that last night. After dinner, I went outside. I still had plenty of time before dark, so I wanted time alone. I needed to think and plan. I also needed to grab my baseball bat from the garage because I wanted to feel protected that night. Whether or not a baseball bat would have worked on the intruders, I don't know. I just needed something to hold on to, something to make me feel as though I could put up a fight. As I walked out of the garage, bat in hand, I heard a laugh in the distance. At first, I stopped walking and turned toward my driveway, because I hoped that my friends would ride up on their bikes and I'd have an entire army by my side. Nobody came. The laugh faded into an echo and then disappeared, and I was left standing alone outside, listening to cicadas all around me. Ever since I was very young, I've always loved the smell of the air during the summer. Despite the humidity, it carried the sense of flowers blooming and freshly mowed grass. Every so often, the wonderful smells would suddenly turn disgusting as I picked up the scent of a skunk or some animal droppings, and I always thought it was hilarious as a kid. I'd run back to the house gagging and grabbing my neck as though I were choking to death. Then it would pass, and the sweetness of summer would return. Frogs croaking, crickets chirping, birds singing. It was all there that night as I listened for the sound of the laughter to return. However, the serenity of the summer air was gone. Now I was waiting to be attacked. I heard the laughter again, this time coming from behind me. I whirled around, gripping the bat tightly in my hand. The intruders were out there, in the grass or the woods, and I couldn't see them, but I knew that they could see me. They were all around me, circling like vultures. The sky was just starting to show hints of sunset, and the darkness would embolden the intruders. I knew that if they weren't scared off by sunlight, they would be worse at night. They could speak, they could touch me, they could steal the blanket off my bed. The intruders could do whatever they wanted to me, and I was helpless to stop them. How do you fight something like that? My baseball bat was useless. I knew that I would just swing at thin air while the intruders laughed and whispered. I prayed as I stood there in my yard, listening to the laughter come and go, moving all around me, coming closer and then moving farther away. I prayed for protection. I prayed for help. I heard the phone ring inside of my house, through the screen door in the kitchen, so I walked closer to the house, listening as my mother went to the phone and answered it. My mother smiled and said, "Oh, hey, Jess." Jess was Mike and Alex's mother, so I held my breath as I watched my mother speak on the phone. Mike would have gone home and told Alex what happened. Together, they would have told Caleb and Tyler. All of them would have coordinated a plan. They'd ask their parents if they could sleep over, and they'd pack backpacks full of supplies, crosses, holy water, whatever they could think of to fight monsters in the night. I could feel hope rising in me as I stood outside the kitchen door. My mother didn't notice me there, so she didn't attempt to hide what she was saying. At first, she was smiling as she talked with her friend on the phone. I heard her say that I was doing pretty good, all things considered. As a kid, I didn't know what that meant, all things considered, but it sounded bad to me. Then her smile faded and she said, "He said what?" My heart sank. I knew that my backup wasn't coming. Mike and Alex had probably begged their parents for a sleepover and had been turned down. I could imagine the whole conversation. The two of them would insist that they had to come over because I needed them. They would argue with their parents, saying whatever it took. At some point, this would mean telling them the truth. Mike would tell his parents what I had told him. His parents would think that I was insane and forbid my friends from ever seeing me again. They'd tell all of the other parents, cutting me off from anyone who could help me. Then they would call my mother and let her know what was going on with me. They'd tell her that they were worried, but what they would really mean was that they didn't want me seeing their kids until I stopped being crazy. In fact, I heard my mother say the words, "That's crazy," as she sat down on a stool beside the kitchen counter. She smiled, but not in a fun way. It was the way a person smiles when something is so absurd that you can't believe what you're hearing. Then she put a hand over her face and shook her head. I watched as my mother started to cry, and she said, "I just don't know what to do." That's when I felt the worst. My mother was crying over her crazy child. She wasn't panicking or angry. She was defeated. Seeing her that way made me feel the same way she did, and my eyes began to well up with tears, but I was desperate not to cry. I needed to hold back because if I cried, that meant that I was giving in to defeat. I didn't know what I was going to do at that point, but I knew that I couldn't give up. There was another laugh in the distance, and when I turned to face it this time, I realized that if I just ran in a straight line right toward that laugh, I would end up in the field. Run a little farther and I'd be at the river. Lucy warned me not to go there. I wasn't sure why, but I knew that I couldn't go. I was going to return to the house with my baseball bat and head upstairs to prepare for the night ahead, but I stopped when I reached the screen door. My mother was no longer on the phone. She was standing by the kitchen table, whisper yelling at my father. I didn't hear everything she said, but I could see her gesturing toward the front door, where I'd gone out. Then she gestured toward my room upstairs. She picked up one of my father's library books and held it up, and I heard her tell him that it wasn't enough. Books weren't the help I needed. I needed a professional. I needed to go away. The urge to cry returned to me as I listened to the bits and pieces of conversation and put them together in such a way that I honestly believed that my mother wanted me gone. In my entire life, I have never experienced anything as soul-crushing as that moment, and the thought occurred to me that if I died, maybe they would finally believe me. My mother glanced toward the back door mid-sentence. When she saw me standing there, she stopped talking and just stared at me. She didn't know how much I had heard, and she had no idea what she was supposed to say to me, so she said nothing. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say or do either. As far as I was concerned, in that moment, my parents were as dangerous to me as the intruders. They were worse, because they had betrayed me. They were supposed to love me and keep me safe, and now they just wanted to throw me away. My hands tightened on the baseball bat. If they wanted to see what crazy looked like, it would have been so easy for me to show them. If they thought that they regretted the day I was born now, I could make them regret it even more. But no, I needed to be smart. I needed to make them think that I hadn't heard a thing and everything was as normal as possible. Maybe Mike was exaggerating. Maybe Jess was being dramatic, just like my mother always said she was whenever Jess wasn't around. When my father turned to see what my mother was looking at, I smiled as innocently as possible. "Nice bat," my father said, clearly suspicious. I walked inside and said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to swing it in the house. Mike told me that if you sleep with a baseball bat under your bed, you'll wake up a better player. He's probably lying, but it's not like it can make me any worse." "Sorry, Mike. Someone had to be thrown under the bus, and it turned out to be you." I didn't wait for my parents to say anything else to me, because I didn't want to hear what they had to say. At that point, I had enough to deal with. I just wanted to stay as far away from them as possible. They didn't try to stop me as I went upstairs, and they didn't follow me either. I went into my room and closed the door. The setting sun was throwing harsh orange light and sharp shadows around my room. It looked like the place was on fire, and I have to admit, I probably wouldn't have minded if it were. I put the baseball bat under the sheet on my bed and looked for any other preparations that I could make to the room. If I stood long enough and stared at my reflection in the mirror, I would reach a point where it didn't look like me staring back anymore. It would look like some other thing, taking my face and using it against me. I hated it, so I turned the mirror toward the wall. After that, I went to my windows and made sure that they were locked. I had a cross necklace that my aunt had given me for Christmas. I normally kept it on my dresser, but I moved it to the nightstand. I didn't know whether or not any of these things would make a difference that night, but I couldn't just sit there and wait for the intruders. I needed to at least feel as though I were being proactive. Lastly, I said another prayer. It was becoming a habit of mine at this point, to pray for help and for protection. However, in begging God to step in, I made myself more scared. With each minute that passed, I would pray a little bit harder, and the knot in my stomach would grow just a little bit tighter. By the time it was fully dark outside, my head was throbbing and my stomach ached. I didn't hear the laughter outside anymore, but I didn't fool myself into believing that the intruders were gone. They wouldn't allow me to have a peaceful night. We were past that. As I brushed my teeth and listened to the sound of the water running from my faucet, it reminded me of the river that flowed in the woods. Out there, somewhere, was the key to figuring out this mess. I could feel it, like a compass inside of me, pressing me to go back there. What would that clue be? A grave? Or some ancient artifact? A carving in one of the stones? A letter written in blood? Would I even know this clue when I saw it? Except, I wouldn't see it. Lucy told me not to go back there. She knew something that I didn't. It was dangerous. I turned off the water and left my bathroom. Once again, my father was waiting for me in my room when I got there. He was standing near one of my windows, looking out into the darkness. Rather than turn when I walked into the room, my father just asked me if I'd had any more trouble with the security light. I told him that the light hadn't gone on in days. Then I walked closer to my bed, and he said to me, "Have you heard any weird noises outside tonight?" I hesitated, wondering why he was asking me this question. It was too much to hope that he would finally believe me, so I didn't tell him that I'd heard the laughter earlier. I just shrugged and told him that everything was quiet. He walked away from my window and looked around the room, noting the cross on my nightstand. Though I was thinking as hard as I couldn't come up with an excuse for that, so I said nothing about it. "Have you seen anything strange outside?" my father asked. When he realized how suspicious he was beginning to sound, he added, "I thought I heard something earlier." I shook my head. "Take a look anyway," he said. "Your eyes are better than mine." Something wasn't right about this conversation, and I knew that, but what could I do about it? I needed to play these games and keep up the act of being perfectly normal. I walked to the window and looked outside into the darkness. I had to cut my hands over the glass to see outside, and when I looked, I saw nothing, but I did hear something. I heard laughter, much closer than before. As I heard it, I pulled my face away from the window. Now seeing the reflection of my room once again, I saw my mother standing in the doorway. I spun and looked at both of my parents, half expecting them to attack me, but I didn't want to show fear. Instead, I put my hand to my chest and smiled as I told her that she'd scared me. I heard the laughter again. Neither one of my parents reacted to it. They couldn't hear it, or if they could, it didn't surprise them. If they came for me, what could I do? The baseball bat was on my bed, and there was no way that I would be able to reach it in time to... To what? Beat my parents to death with a baseball bat? My mouth felt very dry all of a sudden, and I didn't know which way was up anymore. I didn't know what was real and what wasn't. I thought that maybe I really was crazy. Maybe I did need help. The security light went on outside, and my room was filled with the bright light, which made both of my parents wince out of reflex. My father walked toward the window, asking, "Is something out there?" He and I looked out together, and as my father looked out across the yard into the tall grass and the trees, he saw nothing. I saw a person. Or, it was the shape of a person, like a shadow on the very edge of the light, standing in the tall grass. There was no face or color in its clothing, just shadow. It reminded me of seeing my own reflection in the mirror when all of the lights were out. When I saw the intruder standing there, I knew that it was waiting to come in. Maybe it had been out there every night, I didn't know, but I had never seen it before. There had been comfort in never seeing it, and now that comfort was gone. What's worse was the fact that the intruder knew that I'd seen it. There was no sheet to hide under this time. You see anything? My father asked, turning to me. I shook my head and said, Nope. Then I went to my bed and went through the motions of preparing to go to sleep, though I knew that there would be no sleep that night. There might never be sleep again. My mother took my face in her hands and said, You look sick. Do you feel sick? I did feel sick. Every cell in my body felt sick and exhausted, but I didn't tell her that. I just said, I'm fine. You'd tell me if you weren't? She asked, and I nodded. You want me to hang out for a while? My father offered. I did want my father to stay, but I wanted the father that I knew and trusted. I didn't want this version of him, who was looking for an excuse to make me disappear. I told him that I was fine to be alone. After all, I'd have been alone even if he was there. My parents lingered as though they didn't want to leave the room. It was like they wanted to say something to me, but they didn't. I wondered about that, but it didn't change anything. Outside, the intruder laughed again, and my parents left my room. They turned out the light as they went, and closed the door, but not all the way. I didn't lie down in my bed right away. Instead, I sat with my back to the windows, listening to the thing outside. There was some defiant piece of me that was daring the intruder to come in while I was wide awake, but I knew that it wouldn't. Part of this game was me lying down and closing my eyes, allowing myself to be vulnerable because I was too scared to do anything else. I played my part well. For days, I'd been the obedient victim of this thing and allowed it to come at me however it pleased. I hated it, but what else could I do? I had to at least try to sleep at some point. A while passed, and I knew that the thing wouldn't come while I waited for it. This might seem like a victory, but it just meant that it had broken me in. Now it could cause a sleepless night without even being in the room with me. I could hear the echoes of its laugh in my memory. It knew exactly what it was doing, and while I might fight for a little while, I knew that I would eventually give it what it wanted. My body felt so heavy that night. I was more exhausted than I had ever been before. I was losing track of where the real world ended and my own scared imagination began. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to find a way to put this thing back where it came from, but I was just a kid. Kids didn't solve mysteries. They became the mystery.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.